And we're back, and I'm super stoked for multiple reasons. One is that my little suit finally came in. I've been waiting and waiting and waiting, and it finally came. And it's one of those things where I said, this can be either super tacky or super awesome, because the whole matching print thing. I think it's super awesome. I don't know what you think, but there we go. Second is that today's book, Hollow City by Ransom is probably one of the best middle books that I've read. If you know a lot about literature, you know that middle books are kind of like middle children. They just get forgotten. And as a middle child, I'm allowed to say this. There's just something about them where they're bridging the gap. They don't tend to be as great as the first one, and then they don't have the excitement of the third one. However, Hollow City, it did a bang up job. It's obviously been a while since I've read this book. Sorry, Siri. Apparently she thought I was talking to her. I've read Miss Peregrine probably 5 times. Hollow City, apparently I have not read that many times because I was caught off guard by the end. It was one of those things where I was listening to it, and if you saw my last review, you know I said, please do not judge it by its audiobook. It is vastly improved with Hollow City. I got so caught up in the audiobook that when it ended, I was like, we're done? However, that leads me to something that I am so happy to report. I don't have to keep my secret. I told you in the last book that there was something that I wanted to talk about, but I just didn't want to spoil it too much. And so I'm gonna start out with that spoiler here, and that is the children do not actually rescue Miss Peregrine. They actually rescue her brother, Call. If you missed my last review, you really ought to go back and read it, just because this is one of those series that if you don't read the prior books, you're not going to get the next ones, which is why it was so important for me to go back and read them all so that I could give a proper review of the Desolation of Devil's Acre, because I forgot so much that I didn't like the book. So I'm hoping I like it better. A little recap is this. The peculiar children, their loops have begun to be raided by the bad guys, the Hologas and the Whites, who essentially want to take over their world. They're like corrupt peculiars. Jacob and his gang of merry men return to their loop to find that Miss Peregrine, their leader, has been kidnapped. They chase after the bad guys, and Jacob thinks that the bird that they pull out of the ocean is Miss Peregrine. Towards the end of Hollow City, we learn that it's not her, that it's her brother. And what had happened is still a little confusing to me. I did have some of my questions answered, but the glaring one to me is still, how did they perform the switch? Because Call says that they had captured Miss Peregrine days earlier, but how can that be possible if they had seen Miss Peregrine days earlier? Because another one of the Ymbyrnes had come in, and there's all this to do, and that is when Jacob and his friends decide to get some answers. So I still don't quite understand when the switch happened. What I like to think, what I think makes the most sense, is when the White invades the Peculiar's loop, he somehow makes the switch. Although it still doesn't make sense, because I'm like, how did they get Miss Peregrine out without the children seeing 2 birds, unless it's more of when he hid the children or when he locked the children in the basement, that's when he had time to do a switch. The thing is, the Ymbyrnes, who control the loops and who keep time stabilized so these peculiar children can live, they turn into birds. Only the women can be birds, and it turns out that Miss Peregrine had 2 brothers, and they were raised amongst Ymbyrnes at the school that she was going to. However, since they're guys, they couldn't become become birds. They can't become Ymbyrnes and have the power of an Ymbyrne. Yet somehow Call is able to turn into a peregrine falcon, just like Miss Peregrine turns into a peregrine falcon. So I do wish we'd gotten a little bit more of Call and his peculiarities. And that's not something I remember ever getting from this series, so maybe it will prove me wrong. I forgot enough about this book that it's quite possible. That's the thing, is he or she does not revert back to human form after she's rescued. So the children all think, well, maybe she's just been hurt, and then it becomes a race against time, because if an Ymbyrne stays in bird form too long, then they stay a bird. They lose their humanity. So they're racing against time to find the one last Ymbyrne they believe to be free, only to get to that point and Call reveals himself. Or actually, she coaxes him out of his bird form, which confuses me because I think it's just, there's so many red herrings in this book, blaming all of Miss Peregrine's increasingly odd behavior on the fact that she might be turning into a legitimate Peregrine, when in actuality it is Call doing things that will benefit him and the Whites and the Hologast. You do get the sense that there's something wrong with him. He has also been somehow hurt in the midst of the struggle, and so yeah, it's hard for him to turn back. But then when they find Miss Wren and she goes through these motions of helping Miss Peregrine become human again, that's when I'm like, he really must have been stuck in some sort, because it shouldn't have taken all night for her to bring him out if he'd had the power to do it all along. But anyways, he reveals himself, and then he reveals that somehow the Whites have surrounded them. And that's another question for me, is how was he communicating with them? Because he has been in the children's possession the entire time, and there were times when they ran into Whites, when they encountered Whites and they battled them. And so I think this is really great, where you're led to believe that they are in danger of being captured because the Whites want Miss Peregrine, their bird. Yet, in actuality, it could just be Call misleading the children and lulling them into a false sense of security, as in they have what the bad guys want. But how he was able to communicate with them and be like, time and place, because I think they knew where Miss Wren was, or maybe they didn't, because that's why he stayed as a bird, and he, I guess, orchestrated this whole plan to go with the children, was so that they could lead him to Miss Wren. Whether he actually knew where she was or not, I don't know. Maybe he knew her location, he just didn't have access to her because he needed people she would trust to actually gain her inner circle. The Whites surround them and things go as they go. So there's a lot of things in here that there were moments where I was like, with the knowledge, like I knew the entire time. That's one thing I remembered. It wasn't Miss Peregrine, it was Call. And so there were moments where I was like, are the Whites playing a game, or do they really think that the kids have Miss Peregrine because all they want is the bird? She / he is always referred to as the bird, so it's really ambiguous. So are they wanting Call back, or do they truly believe that the children have Miss Peregrine? So it's these little things that make storytelling great, because in retrospect you're like, oh my gosh, this all has completely different meaning. Then on the other hand, is it like Ransom Riggs didn't quite know what he was getting himself in for or where he was going? I'm gonna go with the former, just because I enjoy his storytelling. I think he's incredibly intelligent. Despite some of my questions, I believe Ransom Riggs knew what he was doing the whole time, and he was just planting seeds that on the surface seem one way, but when you dig a little deeper are actually another way. That is essentially the plot, is the children are trying to find Miss Wren because they want Miss Wren to turn Miss Peregrine back into herself. And one thing that I love so much about Hollow City is all of the new peculiars we meet. It's a good thing and a bad thing. I enjoy Ransom Riggs' creativity and the way that he would take a picture like this, which, why do stores have to do this? Why do they have to put a sticker on here? But he finds a great picture like this. And for me, I'd be like, how in the world can I make a story out of this? And he just decides, you know what? She's going to be a peculiar who can heal herself. This girl in the book, her name is Sam. I thought she was fantastic. She was super feisty. They run across her in war-bombed London. She and her sister have been hiding out in their house. She doesn't know she's peculiar. Well, she does and she doesn't. But then the children come and they're like, oh my gosh, you're so great and you should come with us. But then they argue about something, and she was like, you know what, if this is the kind of people you are, I don't want to come with you, because her sister is normal, and she's like, if you don't value the life of normals, aka you don't think my sister has any value, then why would I want to be part of your society? So she ends up being left behind, and we get, like, sometimes the storytelling pulls out of itself and goes from where Jacob's going along telling us what is happening, and then he'll, like in this instance with Sam, he'll say, well, we learned later that XXX. And so it's not really a bad thing, because it's such a smooth transition, it doesn't stick out that much, but at the same time, I did notice a lot more kind of breaking the fourth wall in this book than in the first one. It gives it a good voice, but at the same time, it's like with Harry Potter, and sometimes Rowling would pull way back, and you're like, what in the world? Why do I now get the thoughts and goings on of tertiary characters? Good and the bad of meeting new peculiars is the cast is already quite large. I could tell that Riggs, he essentially had a handful of pictures and said, I'm going to use these. Then he assigned them all peculiarities, only to realize he can't possibly use all of these children. And their peculiarities aren't all going to be helpful for the continuation of the series. And so he does end up leaving two of the characters, Fiona and Claire, in a certain location. Claire is one that I never understood necessity for her, because she has, what is it called, a back mouth, which means she has a mouth in the back of her head. And so while it's cute and clever and all, I'm like, how does that advance anything? Like, how can she be useful? Fiona, on the other hand, is quite useful. She's like a Mother Nature kind of girl, where she can manipulate the earth and grow things. So I was kind of sad to leave her behind when, you know, we probably could have left someone like Olive, who is so light she floats. Even Enoch. He was super helpful in the first book, but then his ability to raise the dead didn't do so much in the second book. He did serve as a good antagonist, though, because he's a negative thinker, and so he did cause strife within the group with some of the things that he would say or do. I think we could have also left maybe a couple other peculiar children, just because there were so many. And then we meet Milena, and we meet the blind brothers, pick them up and carry them with us when they don't do anything. Blind brothers do play a little bit into Jacob and Emma being able to escape the Whites. But Milena, she's really great when we first meet her, and her telekinetic ability is superb. But aside from a little bit of information that she gives in terms of finding Miss Wren, it's just like dropping some characters off just to pick up some more, and them doing very little to advance the plot. Anyways, the children, the book picks up with them rowing through the ocean, trying to get to London. They encounter a horrible storm and they're essentially stranded. So now they have to find their way from point A to London. They encounter a great number of hurdles. I thought this was funny. Something that I'm so glad. Like, it's something I don't really understand because of the time period I live in, and so I'm glad that it worked out in the end. But they eventually make it to a train station. Horace pulls out this wad of cash and essentially uses every dime they have to buy the children their own car, their own train car, only for them to get captured by the whites. And so I was like, holy cow. You know, me being frugal or just being money-minded, because I'm just like, oh my gosh, what you could have done with that, you just totally wasted it. It turns out that their tickets were still good for the next train, and they were fine, and they made their way. But I was just like, you completely wasted however thousands of dollars. They make it to London, and they're like, what do we do? What they discover is that, and there's a book on this too, there's Tales of the Peculiar. And they've realized that the Tales of the Peculiar have hidden meanings. So if you read them and you parse them for meaning, you can glean information from them. And they realize that the pigeons that hang around St. Paul's can help them find Miss Wren. They managed to follow a pigeon to another loop, and this is where I have some questions. This is a loop that had been Miss Wren's, and it had been raided, but she had left prior. And so this is when we meet Melina and the blind brothers. What I don't understand, and this is when I don't know if Riggs has quite fleshed out his loops. The first thing that Jacob sees is a dead body. With that body is a note essentially saying, I didn't want to be taken. I'd rather age forward and die this way than have the whites get me. When they go into the house, they find some more bodies, some which have aged further than others. And so my question is this: how do the loops work? Because I know it's like a temporal freeze, so that when children come into this loop, into this certain time period, they stop aging. But they can go out of the loop. Like with the Peculiar Children, their loop is in 1945. They left the island in order to go to London, but they were still in 1945, so none of them were aging forward. Even though the loop collapsed because Miss Peregrine was not there to reset it. Why is it that when we get to this loop, even though it's collapsed, the Peculiar Children have aged forward? Because they didn't leave the loop, so technically it should still be whatever time and place that it was set at. I don't really know if there's anything outside of their loop the way there is with the Peculiar Children, because they have access to a town. So I don't know if this particular loop is just the house and the land that it sits on, if they have access to anything else without going out of the loop. But I was like, how are these Peculiar Children aging forward if they're still in their loop? It may have collapsed, but it should still be in that same time period. That's something else where then Jacob, in his decision to come with Peculiar Children rather than staying in the present, since Miss Peregrine has been captured and their loop has collapsed, it means that he can't get back to his own time period without her, which doesn't make sense to me, because if they can jump from time to time, eventually he should be able to find, as he does, he should be able to find a loop back to his own time period. And so Riggs tries to explain this away at some point, in which Emma tells Jacob that she thinks maybe Miss Peregrine had been there somehow in order to help him get back, because when they were leaving that house, because after they found Miss Wren and she'd been captured and they were being taken back to the present, Emma's like, you shouldn't have been able to pass through into the present. But the thing is, when they were leaving that one house loop where they met Melina and the blind brothers, when they were passing back from that loop into the 1940s, Jacob and his crew had to go first so that Melina and the blind brothers would then go back into the 1940s rather than stay in their time period. Which I guess that answers my question. That if they'd walked out of their loop, they would have stayed in their time period. Anyways, so when the children were captured by the whites, and then the whites walked through the loop entrance first, it brought them back to present day. So doesn't it work the same way, where Jacob would go into whatever time period the whites are leading him into? I don't know. I don't quite buy Emma's explanation, because it feels a little too flimsy, which she admits. So I think that's Riggs's attempt to explain it without really having a good explanation. The children, they go to that loop, they find Melina, they come back to the 1940s, they figure out how to get to Miss Wren. They discover a frozen house, and it turns out that when the whites had invaded, basically where the Council of the Ymbyrnes meets, it's like the headquarters of all peculiars. One of the peculiars, who has the power to freeze, had frozen the whole thing over. When the children go there, Olive is like, well, maybe we just need to call for her, and Miss Wren appears out of the crowd, which I'm like, so was she just hanging around the crowd waiting for peculiar children or something to come find her? She approaches them, and they ask her who she is. Instead of answering, she turns into a bird and then leads them through a secret passage into the house. And the thing about the Ymbyrnes is, when they transform, they don't have any clothes when they return to their normal form. And maybe I missed this, but it seems like Miss Wren definitely was clothed before she got back into the house. So maybe there'd been a stash of clothes and I wasn't paying attention when she transformed back into her human self. And then the children spend the night waiting for Miss Peregrine to return to herself, only to realize it's Call. And then he's like, well, all my whites are outside. There's no point in escaping. They're all captured, and as they're led back to the present, a scuffle breaks out. There's a distraction. Emma and Jacob are able to escape. They also meet up with a peculiar dog named Addison, who I think Addison is one of the most annoying characters I've ever encountered. And he's supposed to be annoying. He's incredibly pompous and egotistical. But for a dog that is so smart, because he's a talking dog, he's an intelligent, he's peculiar, he's not a regular dog, I would think that he would know a time and place in which to speak and not speak. So his pompousness really rubbed me the wrong way, and I wanted to like him, but I was ready to be rid of him. That is essentially where the story ends, is the hologast approaches them. Jacob is able to stop the hologast, and he realizes this is a new development within his peculiarity, and there we go. Sometimes when I read a book, I'm ready for it to end, and I'm relieved when it finally happens. This one, I was sad that it was over. I think it's because I know there's so much great stuff to come, and that I didn't want to stop. Thankfully, I can just jump right into the third, not a problem. That's what makes Hollow City such a great middle book, because there was a lot of forward momentum. There are times when I read books and I think, oh my gosh, couldn't the hero, couldn't the protagonist, couldn't the good guys have dealt with this a different way? It feels really contrived. And in this book, it didn't. They encountered realistic obstacles. They tried their best. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they failed. They got in trouble, they got out of trouble. I liked how smart they were, where they're like, this is our end game, this is how we're gonna get there, and these are the tools that we have to do it. If I could have every book, not just every middle book, but every book have the kind of momentum of Hollow City, I'd be in good shape. The one aspect that, aside from Addison, that I didn't really care for was the romance between Emma and Jacob. I like the romance, And I guess by this point they've known each other for 3 weeks. The beauty of Riggs's writing is that a lot happens within a small period of time, so it feels like it's been longer. But they're already declaring their undying love for each other, and we all know how I feel about that. I can accept it only because it does feel like they've known each other for a really long time. But I just can't stand it. I'm like, first off, have we determined whether or not Emma likes Jacob or if she's still holding a torch for his grandpa? Second, I'm like, Jacob, you've never been in a relationship before. So, how do you know this is really love and not just first relationship emotions? It's super minor. It's never bothered me before. It's been super sweet every time I've read it. But this time, it made me roll my eyes, and so I don't, think of it however you want to think about it. Tell me what you think about it. Do you like the whole I love you after 3 weeks thing, or do you not really care? I am looking forward to, I keep wanting to call Library of Souls other book names. I'm excited to read it because I remember my first read through, I wasn't impressed. I thought that it lacked some of the more interesting elements of the first two, but now that the first two are fresh on my mind, we will see how I feel about it. And yeah, let me know if you've read this series. Let me know which one is your favorite, who's your favorite character, who's your favorite peculiar or peculiarity. What do you like most about this series? And I will see you tomorrow for Library of Souls. Bye.